Hereby, I will like to open our today's event. Hi, my name is Maria Skora. I'm in charge of international dialogue at das Progressive Zentrum. It's a think tank in Berlin, and I'd like to welcome you to this debate. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you're watching us. This debate, Metro Diplomacy, Cities as Transatlantic Changemakers, is a part of a new urban progress project, a project that is supported by the Federal Ministry of Economy and implemented by 3 organizations, by das Progressive Zentrum, by our partner also here in Berlin, Alfred Hausen Gesellschaft, and our great colleagues in Washington, D.C., the PPI, Progressive Policy Institute. And with this project, we want to rejuvenate transatlantic partnership. We want to rejuvenate transatlantic relations, looking at the cities, city initiatives, engaged citizens in metro areas, and connect them in the US, American cities, and German cities. And by this exchange, help the relations between Europe and the United States to flourish. We are opening a new era, so to speak, after the election. So let's see what the future brings us. And we are also meeting today by the occasion of publishing of our working paper, which summarizes the so far results and findings of the project. We already had 2 conferences, one in Washington, D.C., still in pre-corona times, and one digital here in Germany, to look at challenges and problems cities on both sides of the Atlantic are facing, and to try to find a common ground how we can approach it. So this is what we summarized in the paper, which serves as a background for our conversation today, conversation with Almut Möller from Hamburg and Steve Benjamin from Columbia, South Carolina, moderated by Will Marshall, the president of PPI. I wish us all interesting conversation, and wish us all a good debate, that we all learn a lot today.
Let me say, before we get to our very special guest, that not so long ago in the United States, the big cities were symbols of decay and dysfunction. I'm talking about the 80s and late 70s and 80s and early 90s in the United States. And they have just undergone a remarkable transformation. Today, our big cities are hubs of policy innovation of the kinds that Claudia was just talking about. And they're the test beds for the innovative solutions that smart people are creating and to solve problems from the ground up. And so it's just been a remarkable transformation, and it's coincided, unfortunately, with a kind of paralysis at the top, that is at the national level in the United States. Our national government is stymied, maybe paralyzed is too strong a word, but sometimes it doesn't seem like it, like today. But our national government is stymied by deep political polarization, by ever-mounting debt and bureaucratic sclerosis. And so the Progressive Policy Institute has for a long time now been an advocate of going local. We think that it's time for progressives in the United States to stop thinking in terms of trying to nationalize solutions in Washington, but instead to take advantage of America's flexible federalism. And I note that Germany has also a federal structure. It's different, but it also has its own version of federalism. But in the United States, we have the ability to devolve decisions and resources to metro leaders, to local government leaders. And right now, at least, the view is that local governments are more responsive, they're more efficient, they're less tribalized by political differences, and they are much more trusted by the citizens of the United States. And one of my frustrations in this late election we just had in the United States was the absence of conversation, of a focus on the way cities, metros are leading in solving the nation's problems. Sometimes you'd think it's all done by Washington, and that's just not the case. anymore. I'm very proud to join with Das Progressive Zentrum and Alfred Herrhausen-Gesellschaft to organize this transatlantic conversation, which is aimed at sparking a cross-fertilization of ideas for comparing notes between metro leaders and deepening ties across the Atlantic, which have been sort of frayed in recent years. So without further ado, let me introduce our very special metro leader guests that you're going to hear from. They are Almut Möller, who is State Secretary of the Free and Hanseatic City of Hamburg. She's also a prominent scholar of international relations and security and a leading light in the European Council on Foreign Relations. And on the US side, I'm very proud to introduce my very good friend, Mayor Steve Benjamin, who is now in his 10th year as mayor of Columbia, South Carolina, which is the capital of South Carolina. And despite the mayor's youthful good looks, he's really a veteran mayor in America and one of the deans of the mayors in the United States. He's the president of the U.S. Council of Mayors, and in that capacity, sort of an urban statesman who has been a leader on all sorts of issues, from criminal justice reform to housing to clean energy transitions and historic preservation and many others. So we have wonderful metro leaders to talk to today. And my job is just to ask some questions to get the conversation rolling. So let me do that. And I think I'll start with Secretary Mueller, please, because I think your American audience may not be as, may not be clear on exactly, what Hamburg is. Hamburg is both a state and a city, as I understand it. It's a city-state. And if you might just say a few words about that and about your duties as a state secretary of Hamburg, what those entail. And then I'll ask Mayor Benjamin to say a few words to introduce Columbia to our European audience. So Secretary Mueller, you want to start?
Thank you so much, Will, and to the whole team. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. And it's also a great honor to be with you, Mayor Benjamin, in this conversation. It is very timely. It is, I think, one of the key areas in transatlantic relations right now that you're addressing with the project. So I was really delighted to join this conversation. And Will, you were asking straight away a very important question. And I understand that this project is also about getting a conversation going that is about learning. Who are we? Getting to know each other. And in that way, I just want to pick up where you left it on what is Hamburg. Yes, we are a city. We are the second largest city in the Federal Republic of Germany. We are in EU, European Union terms, the largest city in EU Europe that is not a capital city. But we're also a city-state, which means we are part of the German Federation of the 16 federal states. And the role of that I take, nothing to do with me, but the way this position is set up, involves interestingly different layers that are relevant, I think, to our conversation. On the one hand, I represent Hamburg at the Federation. So this is where I find myself right now in our representation office in the heart of Berlin. Where the chamber of the 16 federal states is convening as a second chamber of legislation in the Federal Republic after the first one that is directly elected, obviously, by the people. But I'm also honored to be representing Hamburg in our European and international affairs. That includes our work in Brussels, which is, of course, a very important reference point for Hamburg, because we are not only part of Germany, but we form part of the big European Union. We are metropole regions. We have about 2.1 million inhabitants in Hamburg. The wider metropole region is about 5 million. We have a strong interest. We are located in the north of Germany with a strong interest in obviously our regional environment, Northern Europe, but we span our network, and that is one one point I wanted to mention right from the start, Will, for our conversation. Yes, we do work with partner cities. We also work with partner cities across the globe. We have 9 partner cities, which is probably, I mean, there are cities that have more than just 9, but it shows you how seriously we take them. And in the US, that has been Chicago for quite some time now, and conversations with Mayor Lightfoot, including in the past months of our shared COVID pandemic by the two mayors, Mayor Chench and Mayor Lightfoot, have been, of course, very important for us. But what I'm saying is we have partner cities, but then we also place a great deal of interest into our wider city networks, in our city identity as a European city, with really a lot of initiatives that have been dealing with the question of, inclusive growth, urban mobility in the 21st century, global health questions that we see very clearly, like in a burning glass in our city. So everything that you talked about in the introduction is hugely relevant to us. And I'm particularly delighted that you are leading the transatlantic conversation in this aspect, because our ties to US cities, Hamburg joined the Chicago Climate Charter in mid-2018. Our partnerships with the US are absolutely important for us, and I'm thrilled to be here. And this just as a piece of introduction to place Hamburg a little bit on the map and how we're looking at this question of cities and how they can influence international relations at this stage.
Thank you very much, Secretary. Mayor Benjamin, how about a few words about Columbia, South Carolina, and don't you wish you were a city-state, didn't have to deal with the state legislature?
Thank you, Will. I'm going to try to be on my very best behavior and not speak adversely about other levels of government. I do believe, as our friend Ben Barber said, that cities should rule the world, but that's a whole nother conversation. Thank you, Secretary Möller, and Will, thank you so much for our long-term friendship and for inviting me to participate on behalf of our city. I am Steve Benjamin. I'm the mayor of Columbia, South Carolina. For those of you who are somewhat familiar with the geography of the United States, we are on the East Coast, the Southeast, halfway between New York and Miami. Several hundred miles south of Washington, D.C. We're a state capital, one of obviously the original 13 colonies. State capital, we serve as home not only for our state government, but also the Army's largest training base in the world. We train half of the U.S. Army here in our city. We're home to a large Carnegie One research university, the University of South Carolina, that also enjoys the #1, according to U.S. News and World Report's #1 master's in international business program in the country. Something we're particularly proud of. That program has been so successful because it has been shaped around primarily our significant relationships with European companies and countries. We, as South Carolina, we have more European foreign direct investment in our state per capita than any state in the Union, anchored significantly by investments from Germany, from France, in our city also from Belgium, but obviously BMW's here in South Carolina. Michelin has a significant interest here, as well as in the upper part of our state as well. But because of those various influences, state government, the military, the university, and business ties, we wind up leading a fairly diverse constituency here in Columbia, where our citizens represent almost every one of the 194 sovereign nations of the world. People speak 90 different languages. We celebrate a significant number of diverse religions here. And I believe we're representative of the strength of cities that Will mentioned earlier. In this country, our cities surrounded by metropolitan economies now account for 85% of America's population, 89% of the jobs, 92% of America's gross domestic product is created in cities and metropolitan economies. So as Will mentioned, I am a former president of the United States Conference of Mayors. I'm a former president of the African American Mayors Association, and I also serve as vice chair of the Global Parliament of Mayors, but I'm the lifetime president of the Mayors Mutual Admiration Society. I do believe that, the role that we play leading diverse constituencies requires mayors to significantly avoid the incredible partisanship that has frozen American democracy and certainly a number of countries all around the world, but allows us and requires us to continue to work to actually be progressive pragmatists to solve problems, to not engage in the banter and the rhetoric that never solves problems, only seeks to divide people. And that's what I've tried to do here in Colombia for the last 10 years. Will called me a veteran. When I started this, guys, I didn't have any gray hair and I was 3 inches taller. So things have changed over the last 10 years, but I am so excited about this dialogue. I'm so excited about having a chance to expose our city to a wonderful collection of scholars and diplomats and businesses and thinkers on this call. We have had a strong and robust relationship with Kaiserslautern as a sister city over the last several decades. It preceded me, but it is by far our strongest sister city relationship. And I'm happy to be with you today.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Mayor. I appreciate that. Well, you both sort of started to answer my next question, but let's stay on this this idea of the international role of your cities and how you conceive of that. You know, one of the themes of today's conversation is metro diplomacy, and you know, by which we mean the possibilities of creating dense webs of interaction between metro leaders and actors of all kinds across national borders. And that's become particularly important in the United States in the last 4 years when at the national level, I'll just say there's been a rupture in the usual kind of cooperative and collaborative spirit that has defined the transatlantic relationship for so many decades now. So we had sort of a broken dialogue at the top of the United States government. And that made it all the more important, it seemed to me, for metro leaders to have the kinds of diplomacy that you all have both talked a little about. So just say a little bit more about how you view the benefits. How much time do you spend in foreign travel and trade missions and the like, and how do you view how do you view the benefits of learning from other metro leaders in these in your work, and what role does it play? And you mentioned the global parliament, Mayor. Do we have the kind of structures that can facilitate the dialogue between metro leaders that we probably that we need? Secretary Möller, you want to start us off?
Yes, sure. Thanks, Will, for that opportunity. And I want to map a little bit how Hamburg in general looks at international affairs. We are basically, the model of this free and Hanseatic city of Hamburg has been for many centuries one that says outward lookingness is something that really benefits our city. This is a city and has been for hundreds of years of traders. The Hanseatic League of cities dotted across the Baltic Sea with very, very strong trading ties is still something that influences the spirit of the city. We have a whole number of internationally operating companies headquarters. We are a strong seat of international research. We have very good universities. We, by and large, I always like to say that the model of Hamburg can only work if there is a world that is open to sort of outward lookingness, to engagement, to free and fair trade, to connectivity, that really allows for what we firmly believe in, that is a rules-based international order, multilateralism. And this is something that from my background in international relations, of course, has been for many decades seen as a given and sort of the framework that the Federal Republic of Germany wants to engage in and wants to nurture and also wants to find a stronger role in preserving. But from the regional perspective of a city-state, I can really, really very strongly underline that this is absolutely key for the future of our city. So we see ourselves also as stakeholders, and we cannot influence directly in that way because foreign policy is in the area of of Berlin, the federal government in Berlin. But we are strong stakeholders, and we have other ways of trying to influence that. And part of this sort of instruments that we have is, of course, our relationships with other big cities. And personally, right now, obviously, travel is a bit restricted, but for us, it's very important to at least meet virtually, and especially at a very crucial time for Europe, for European cities as well. I mean, this is a moment in which the European Commission in Brussels, that is deciding how to spend the money, by and large, of EU member states contributing to the EU budget over the next years, has sort of decided that, and we welcome that. Of course, cities are main drivers of implementing change in the areas of climate, sustainability, and they just decided alongside with the EU member states where the money will be spent. And for us, this is one major example to ask where's the coalition of cities in Europe that is really wanting to take that on and to sort of be really the leaders in implementing what we feel is not only something nice to have, but we feel the pressure as well in our cities. If questions of sustainability are not solved, we are most affected in our urban density. And so this is an area that I think about conceptually quite a bit, and it's sort of a more recent development that not only the German federal ministries have started to develop an interest in the role of cities, but also the EU level. And that, by and large, is really driven by an interest in being also closer to the citizens, closer to where decisions are taken. And I welcome that. And I think it's a huge opportunity. And for us, as embedded in the European Union as well, this is also a very important arena that I'm spending quite a bit of time on and trying to sort of not only like the idea, but make it happen as well and forge new partnerships, not so much only in our regional environment, but also on subjects, on themes that we want to develop.
Terrific. Thank you. Mayor Benjamin, you want to tackle that question also? Did your city join the Compact of American Cities that pledged to stay engaged with the Paris, climate compact, despite the Trump administration's pulling America out of that?
We joined before the sunset that day. Yes, as you know, did hundreds of cities. I have the pledge of chairing, as one of the co-chairs, a bipartisan effort with the Sierra Club, Mayors for 100% Clean Energy. Also serve as a member of the Climate Mayors Caucus, led by Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti. And I think that maybe today we have maybe upwards of 400 member cities from across the country who quickly rallied to the point of understanding that that was a grave mistake to exit the Paris Accords, and hopefully we can take some bold action that helps us get things back on track once President Biden is in place. Secretary Mueller couldn't be more correct, and it is amazing to see the parallels, obviously, that we all know exist, and that's why we're on this call. But it's not just the U.S. and Europe. It's Asia, it's Africa and South America. The reality is that cities are not gerrymandered political jurisdictions created by cartographers, and for those who may not be Americans, the term gerrymandered basically just means writing a map around your political interests as opposed to communities of interest. And but cities are born. They're living, breathing organisms that almost compel you to actually focus on the needs of the entire body as opposed to political interests. Actually, Bill Peduto, the mayor of Pittsburgh, who was with you all before, in the good old days, the pre-pandemic, the early days of the pandemic, often says that America has three political parties: Democrats, Republicans, and mayors. And it recognizes the fact that that mayors just have to solve problems because our cities are indeed representative of the health of America in a number of different ways. And we've seen some trends in that direction for several years. I mean, you've been studying this for quite some time. I remember when I was first elected, President Obama was still in office, and primarily because of the challenging relationship he had with the Congress, Democratic White House, Republican House, and eventually Senate. Mayors got so much more involved in working to solve so many problems that usually were not in our purview. Obviously, climate being one of the primary ones. We got involved in trade issues that historically I was traveling around the country with the mayors of Atlanta and Tampa, advocating on behalf of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and trying to make sure that we would protect the interests of our respective constituencies that primarily not only lived inside our cities, but also in the rural areas that surround us. I think we're going to talk about a little bit more lately, but trade, climate change, even immigration, we were actively involved in. And it all recognizes the fact that many of our cities, so you take out some of the largest cities, New York and LA, but Houston sits at the center of a $500 billion GDP. So does Atlanta. New York's GDP, and we have active leadership in our organizations from all these different major city mayors, dwarfs that of most nations across the world. So the requirement that we be actively involved in real problem solving, whether or not our state government or our federal government are actively involved in the discussion, is essential. I do believe the question you asked earlier, Will, that organizations existing and those that may emerge can help fill that void. The Global Parliament of Mayors, I'm actually missing a call with GPM to do this morning, but to have mayors on the call from Dr. Peter Kurtz of Mannheim is our chair this year, but having mayors from Germany and the U.S. and Portugal and from Nepal and Uganda on the call, just talking about issues constantly of mutual interest is it's important. It moves the ball downfield in a football term. I'm sorry, but American football term. But it's essential, and at times when it seems like our federal governments just don't seem to work well, it's that much more essential in the world in 2020.
Thank you both. Those are fascinating comments. I want to kind of focus on the economic role of cities. As both of you have said, that cities have become magnets for investment. They draw talent. And most of the digital innovation that happens, at least in the U.S. economy, is concentrated in about 6 cities. And so you get what the scholars call the agglomeration effects, where cities keep attracting more of the high-end economic investment, and the rest of the country sort of falls behind. And that's obviously been a big factor in the rise of populism on both sides of the Atlantic. And in this country, it used to be, until recently, we saw national development in parallel. That is, cities developed at about the same rate, GDP terms, income terms, as countryside and exurbs, suburbs. But we've had the great divergence where the countryside's fallen and the cities keep rising. Talk a little about, and in the United States, at least, I'm not sure what the picture is in Hamburg, but in the United States, cities also, in addition to having high concentrations of wealthy people, also often have high poverty rates. Just talk to me about your approaches to inclusive growth and innovation, and how you work to overcome inequalities, not only within the bounds of your city, but also within the broader metro regions that your cities pretty much, are the nexus of. And again, Secretary Möller, if you'll start us off.
Thanks a lot. I think it's a great question. My sort of background and experience is in European cooperation. You kindly mentioned my past as an analyst, and that's where I want to start. I've been in this role for about a year, and a lot of the things that I've learned in the past, I transfer to what I'm doing right now, and that is very interesting and insightful for me. I just want to point out that with my background in studying European affairs, EU member states and Germany really as a pivotal part of it, have been trying to really work for many decades towards inclusiveness and cohesion at a larger scale of, the European Union as such. And we know that sometimes this is more an ideal than reality, because of course there are very different parts of Europe, but the very idea really is that cohesiveness brings peace. Cohesiveness really brings what our little patchwork continent of nation states has been missing most for a lot of centuries. And so this is a very big but a very important idea, and to strive towards that is also very relevant for a city like Hamburg. We can only be as strong as our regional environment, our national environment, our European environment. And that might have to do also with more an approach in Europe that is perhaps a quite sort of, I wouldn't say egalitarian, but more looking at social cohesion than perhaps other parts of the world. And I think this is something that is also embedded in the way I look at this challenge. Obviously, we have our cities surrounded by different federal states that are more rural, and I think it's absolutely important to sort of not let that divide that we've seen. And well, you talked about that also developing in political terms, the ones left behind, feeling that in rural communities you really don't play a role, you're not part of the power that is shared by others, but not by yourself necessarily. That is a threat and risk, I think, that has been understood with a bit of a time lag in Europe, because we learned quite a bit from the US over the past decade or so. And I think this is very important to address that. And from our Hamburg perspective, I mean, we're not a single city. We are embedded in a wider region. We're embedded in a wider community. And so I think that is always part of the picture. But having said that, at the same time, and Mayor Benjamin talked about that, there is an immediacy between the people that live in our city and the level of government. People are asking for solutions, and we also have a very diverse, population. Citizens come from various backgrounds. By and large, we are, I believe, a rather, wealthy part of the country. But still, of course, there is a lot of people that won't be able to claim that for their own lives, and that is something that you also, first and foremost, have to keep in mind. But part of the solution is the wider perspective on these things.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mayor Benjamin. How do you think of? I know you have thought and acted, I think, about raising living standards across metro-wide. You just want to talk a little about how you think about that challenge.
Sure. No, it's it may indeed be the challenge of our times. As we try and develop these incredibly innovative cities that, as both of you had mentioned, attempt to incubate the very best ideas and attract the most creative people. And we're watching the impact of automation and advanced machine learning and artificial intelligence just dramatically change the future of work, which obviously displaces a number of people, including people who have, many of whom in this country for sure, a number of people of color, and not only people of color, but people who are Caucasian, who live in parts of the country that have not seen this growth. And it's put us in a precarious position that has fed the flames of division and made them very easy for some to feed. It's gotten that much more difficult, I must say, over the last few years, even more difficult over the last year. As we were speaking, preparing for this call, we were thinking about early this year. It feels like, early this year feels like several years ago. I mean, it feels like we're living dog years now because of how difficult and painful things have been as we work our way through the greatest pandemic since 1918 in this country, and I dare say maybe the world, the greatest economic disruption in an election year since 1932 or 1876, depending on which historian you speak to in the States. And then the greatest social unrest around systemic racism and police violence since 1968, all wrapped up in the three quarters in the United States. It is served as almost an X-ray of the American body, for sure, that exposed several broken bones that existed long before the pandemic, and it's turned into what I believe, quite frankly, is an incredible opportunity. And I think in order to be a mayor, you have to be an optimist. You have to be a realist, but you have to be an optimist. An incredible opportunity to try and do a deep dive into some thoughtful, data-driven, but human-centered solutions that move us forward. We've done a great deal over the last several years in the areas of making sure that everyone has access to housing and affordable housing. As cities have thrived, as we spoke earlier, it has pushed more and more people out of those cities who can't afford to participate. We have watched significant advances in criminal justice policy that we realized just early this year only really scratched the surface of what we needed to do. We didn't need to only reform criminal justice policies. We needed to reimagine them, completely turn the criminal justice system upside down and think about ways that we could create a more just economy. And what we saw, I believe, we've seen more and more of it, but certainly in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, we have really realized exactly how interdependent and interconnected cities all across the globe are. I mean, we saw on every single continent, with the exception of Antarctica, uprisings of people speaking to that very core of the disconnect that they felt from the prosperity that everyone else was enjoying to some degree. We were required, almost because of the pandemic, we were all sequestered at home to watch what affected to a state-sponsored murder of a soul. And I think for many of us, it broke our hearts and opened up a door for us to begin to think much more deeply than even the contract. We've done amazing amounts of contracting with minority-owned businesses. We've worked to try and cure some of these significant systemic issues that have plagued our country, certainly since the birth of a nation. But I do believe that the last several months have lit a fire that we have to keep lit to figure out how we turn all of this passion and its pain into progress, and allows us all to move forward, again, recognizing that probably most of the very best achievable solutions will probably happen on the local level. And then it's our job to figure out how to make those ideas scalable and replicable. And certainly, obviously, as we try to attract resources, make sure, again, that they are data-driven, but also human-centered.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, just to stay on this point one minute longer and get reactions from you all. The cities are our, sort of our economic leaders, but also they're the cultural leaders. Sort of they dominate the culture, and there has been this reaction. Populism and nationalism, both in the United States and in Europe, have been. They demarcate the difference between urban or cosmopolitan culture and in the countryside you have less diverse populations. They're not as they're much more nationalistic. They're not as open as both of you have stressed the openness. Hamburg is a port city, and I know and you have too, Mr. Mayor. But that the urban culture has come to be seen by too many people on both sides as a threat, and that is really what undergirds the terrible polarization we've seen on both sides, and it's given rise to illiberal forces on both sides. Just quickly, it's a big question, so maybe not quickly, but your thoughts about social reconciliation. What are the prospects for bridging the chasm between these two worlds, the worlds of metro cultural and economic dynamism and the feeling of having been left behind, bypassed by history that we see in the countrysides around our big urban centers. Secretary Möller, any thoughts on that from the German perspective?
I believe it's important, and I think the fact that we're not mega cities. I mean, Hamburg is a big city, as I pointed out, by comparison in Europe, but most of the cities in Europe are not that big. And that is an opportunity as well, because then, you know, we are not the continent of the very mega cities that is reserved to other continents. And here, for me, it's important to go to different levels of not necessarily the capital cities, but go and engage with you know, cities that are a lot smaller, and our European network of cities that we've been working on lately allows for that much more easily, because we have a shared umbrella of subjects, you know, in our sort of European associations. And yet you might encounter cities that have some 60,000 inhabitants, or, you know, that are placed far away from their capitals, maybe on the borders of EU Europe. You know, there is a lot of diversity also among the cities. At least I can say that from our European contexts here. And that, I think, is an opportunity, because I feel we have a contribution to make, as we have a contribution in our own city to bridge those cleavages, to do that also in our networks. And I think May Benjamin said also something very important about the past months. The question that sounds so simple has become very important, and that question is, how are you doing? How is everyone? You know, to care about each other, to have that conversation. And this is very powerful, to ask that question. And in every single web call that I've been doing with partners around the globe, really, that is a very important starting point, because it brings us together even more. It motivates us even more to work for citizens, and really also in a compassionate way. You also touched upon culture and the role of culture, Will, and if I understood you correctly, you were pointing out also concerns of a detachment. I am, because of the pandemic, currently worried about, you know, a lot of our cultural institutions that are very important for Hamburg, because they fall victim, obviously, with all the support that can be given to them, and there is quite a bit in our city and from federal government still. They are very important arenas for people to deal with the grief, the loss, the confusion, and to have them suffer, I think, is something that, you know, doesn't only make me sad, it makes me very concerned, because it means that, you know, the places where our people can meet, exchange, digest, suffer, you know, they are threatened in this way as well. And I find the conversation about, you know, the future of our cultural institutions, as we collectively hopefully come out of this by next year, with a vaccination, one that is a very important conversation also between cities.
Mayor Benjamin.
Sure, no, thank you. Thank you, Will. And a comment the Secretary made earlier prompted the need to think more about the question about our connection with our rural brothers and sisters, because you talked about, the reality is that we all are encouraging everyone to socially distance now. But we don't spend as much time on social cohesion, ways in which we can move forward together. And it made me think about early in my tenure as mayor, we had several long-standing sister city relationships, and I was in the process of developing 2 new relationships, one with Accra, Ghana, and the other with Taichung in Taiwan. And a young lady asked me about these relationships, and she was impressed. At least I thought she was impressed. She was curious if we had any sister city relationships with some of the smaller rural towns in our state, who could also benefit significantly from the resources and exposure that Columbia might have. And I had not yet thought about that. So it turned into an opportunity for us to start developing sister city relationships with small towns in South Carolina, in which we'd share resources, we'd share technical expertise in helping them solve problems that we could solve, but they would not be able to do them. We've actually served as sponsors for them on projects with the federal government to help them resolve issues that have stopped them from being able to leverage prospective opportunities. And it's really created a wonderful relationship with a number of these communities. I do believe that if in fact we're going to bridge the gap and hopefully foster a much more meaningful relationship between urban, suburban, and rural America, it's going to, and I dare say across the globe, it's going to require a great deal of intentionality and real investment. I do subscribe to the idea that it is an unfair proposition to tell someone that they must leave their home, they must shed their families, they must almost become refugees to some degree, and go towards an urban core just to participate in capitalism or the American economic experiment as it relates here. So it's going to require, on the very basic level, and how we regard each other, how we speak to each other, how we build these compassionate cities that my friend Greg Fisher says serve as a platform for human potential, but at the very same time recognizing that there are other ways of life, and we have to make sure that we intentionally work together to create the social construct, but also literally work to build the infrastructure that allows these communities to prosper as well. During my tenure as president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, I was able to found the Mayors and Business Leaders Center for Inclusive and Compassionate Cities. It was in the wake of Charlottesville, and it was determined that we needed to do more to make sure we were trained better to pull people together while others were seeking to pull us apart. So that effort, but that effort has to be complemented as well with significant infrastructure investment. I dare say that while we've seen the acceleration of some of the challenges around the future of work that we mentioned earlier because of the pandemic, I think it's also given us some significant opportunities to recognize that, that if in fact we make the investments in infrastructure, in 21st century infrastructure, recognizing that across the globe, and particularly in the US, we are way behind the curve as it relates to building traditional infrastructure. But 21st century infrastructure as it relates to broadband and access to the internet, that if in fact we work with the same intentionality that we did with the Rural Electrification Act almost a century ago, that we took with rural telephone cooperatives to connect people, if we do the same as it relates to broadband by working with the private sector to incentivize their investment, and also finding creative ways to build thoughtful public-private partnerships that will also accelerate that, then we can probably create a new normal that is something we could want to aspire to. But it is going to require some intentionality. And it's going to require some significant investment that also, as we awake from the pandemic, will serve as a catalyst, a stimulus for the job creation that we're going to need to see in each of these communities to get it back on our feet.
Terrific. Well, thank you. We've run a little over, but it's been a really fascinating conversation. I hate to stop in my part of it, but I'm going to have to turn things over to Crystal Swan. But let me just note that both of you ended on an optimistic note of a different dimension of metro diplomacy, which is from the big urban center to the smaller cities and towns and the countryside, which in cultural terms have seen so alienated from the mainstream culture. So thank you. Thanks for that discussion. I thought that was really, really illuminating. So thank you very much both for your excellent and candid comments. And let me now turn the program over to my PPI colleague, Crystal Swan, who will moderate questions and answers with you, our audience. Crystal is a senior policy fellow at PPI. She also comes out of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. For many years, she was in charge of children, healthcare, and human services policy for the conference, and has written a very smart piece for PPI on metro resilience from after this COVID pandemic, what it's shown about lack of shock absorbers in our cities, and then what we can do to build them up. So thank you again, Secretary Möller and Mayor Benjamin. Crystal, over to you.
Thank you, Will. I appreciate that. We have a few questions here, and so what we're going to do is I will put the question out to both of our speakers, and just whoever would like to jump in, or you know, Mayor Benjamin, if you'd like to come in first, that would be great, or Secretary Möller, that would be great. One of the questions is, as cities and federal systems, COVID has deflected unresolved issues on the national level onto cities. And in having to create new protocols on school reopenings and other types of things, whether it's around, I'm going to add a little bit to it, whether it's around hunger issues or school reopenings, how is that collaborative crisis development piece worked across cities? How is it sort of manifested in these cities? Secretary Möller, would you like to, how has that changed the way you've done work?
Sure, thank you very much, Crystal, and also for that question. I think I can say that the German background is more of a collaborative federalism. That means the federal states have been engaging with the federal level, but also cities have been engaging, the largest cities with the federal level in Berlin on fighting the pandemic. And you know, even though it's not an easy process, because every regional leader obviously has a regional situation that can be different, whether you are, like Hamburg is, a big city, or whether you are part of a more rural federal state and a lot bigger in terms of surface with less infection development, etc. While there is diversity, there is still quite a bit of cohesion, and a lot of the sort of firefighting over questions of, you know, access to health institutions, access to supporting funds when it comes to alleviating the damage that COVID has left on our economies. This has been by and large a hand in hand, and I can say that from a fortunate position of being, you know, I think part of a federal state that is seen, has really witnessed, you know, the benefits of that over the past months. Having said that, I believe we all have our lessons to learn, because this pandemic really has sprung upon us in a way that was unexpected. And as Mayor Benjamin pointed out, obviously it was known that there might be such a thing as a pandemic, but earlier this year we had no idea, and there it was. And the way of dealing with such immediate crisis situations, not only with immediate firefighting, but also you know, allowing for the more strategic, more medium to longer term impact on our economies, on our societies, on our cities, I think is absolutely vital. And in that way, we've been trying to engage with partner cities across Europe and also in the US, trying to really identify what we can actually learn in order to do even better in such situations.
Thank you. Mayor Benjamin. It's
been an incredible time. It really has, and I appreciate the Secretary's response. We've had a lot of lessons learned, and we have not had as much of a partnership with our state government or our federal government, and it's required us as cities to build some significant local intergovernmental partnerships, as well as intersectoral partnerships, in which we've been able to pull philanthropy, our incredible public health professionals, our universities, and other local governments into the first. I remember our very first Midlands Coronavirus Task Force meeting very early in the pandemic on March 6th, when we were all in one room, right next to each other. Something we definitely would not do now, but it shows the migration and the maturation we've all gone through over these last several months. So it's difficult to learn lessons. What you do as you kind of go through, when I talk about the pandemic and the economic disruption and the social unrest, someone equated it most recently to someone saying your house is on fire, and as you're fighting the fire, they say, oh, there's a sinkhole right in front of your house as well. And then they say, oh, and there's a tornado coming down the street too. So you're in this constant process innovating and iterating and just trying to solve these complex, literally life-challenging issues on the run. It has given us an opportunity to look at this very serious and rapidly evolving health effect to stress to our constituencies, our citizens, and our corporate citizens and others. First of all, the importance of science and the importance of data. That data, good data gives you intelligence. Intelligence gives you the opportunity to make really good policy that then keeps us focused on our one true goal. We have one goal, one true north, and my citizens are probably tired of hearing me say it. Our one true north is the preservation of human life. That's it. That's it. And so we've used science again and data, and then attempted to humanize that data in a way that gives people, obviously, it helps them avoid the blue and the red and the politics. We're relying on the science. These are our demarcation points. These are measurable goals that we're trying to achieve. And the reason that we're doing this is because we want to make sure that you and your family remain healthy as we eventually emerge from this pandemic. But probably the greatest lesson has been we've been able to build some incredible partnerships and relationships and been able to do them rather quickly. It's amazing how crisis gives you the opportunity to build some partnerships, because we have not had the leadership or support, just being frank, on the state or federal level. I look forward to the very near future where we do have that sense of a focus on social cohesion and being able to move forward together, and we start seeing this multi-level partnership that allows us to realize that the only way we're going to get out of this is if we do it together.
Thank you. Thank you. We have quite a few questions, but one, and you all touched on it earlier, the disproportionate impact of the coronavirus on different populations. And one question is, the coronavirus pandemic has been called a she-cession. So she-recession, given the negative impact and social impact, in particular on women. Are there any good practices, and how can cities promote women's participation in the economy as we kind of move forward? I know that's maybe more of a US question, but I put it to both of you as well.
Sure, I don't mind tackling it first. I remember very early in my public life, I was a cabinet secretary to our governor. And I remember reading a study, I believe it was from the University of Minnesota, that showed that the governments on every level that had more women in leadership positions and elective office tended to make much better policy and much better decisions that inured to the benefit of the communities that they serve. I remain a believer of that fact. And in every society, I dare say, certainly here in the US, that is representative of the fact. My wife, whom I'll be leaving you all and going to one of our hearings, she's our chief judge here in the community in which we live. And she has a process she has to go through regularly as she continues to move along. She's had a storied career as a prosecutor, as a judge. But the reality is, at the end of the day, she's still very much mom, and she is very much involved in our household, raising our two daughters, and I think there's just something significant there. I will say that the issues regarding disparate impact, we've seen significant disparate impact, certainly on every racial minority, on people who live in the bottom quintile of American economic society. Early on, very little access to personal protective equipment, and overrepresentation in the number of jobs that do not allow for social distancing. A significant number of women are in those jobs and positions. And that's why very early on, we established a disparity task force here in the city that would allow us to focus primarily on 5 principles: access to care for everyone, access to services in people's neighborhoods, as we deal still with the kind of the geographic disconnect everyone can't get to the places they need to get to potentially receive services. Access to information, not just in the beginning of the pandemic, but still, it's amazing how much bad information comes from what should be reliable sources, and making sure people were getting good information. We wanted to make sure that we supported low-wage employees as it relates to access to PPE and policies that we passed here in the city to ensure their safety. And again, continuing and constantly building our capacity as it relates primarily to intersectoral relationships, so that we can take the leadership from our public health community and push that out very aggressively into the community. But again, it does take, first of all, requiring that we recognize the challenges with disparate treatment, disparate impact, and how those issues have accumulated over the years, and then be very intentional about addressing it.
Thank you.
Just very briefly, Crystal, I think, I mean, the problem in Hamburg and Germany at large might be a little bit, look a little bit less sort of intense and demarcated. But I'd say, I mean, the She session is real. It's also being observed, it's being discussed. Just a footnote, but it's important. Germany features among the countries where the gender pay gap is for many surprisingly wide still, even though the image of Germany is often a different one, with leaders even at the highest level of government, and women in strong positions. That does all exist, but I think this by and large is a subject for our society as much as it is in the US. From various angles it looks perhaps a little bit different. I think over the past months, and I say this as a mother of two small daughters in a pandemic situation, and Mayor Benjamin has been describing the challenge. This also brings, the problem really home. We're all in it together. We have to stay at home. We have to engage our families, and it makes us very clear again how much we rely on educational institutions that can help us. And so in Hamburg, we have tried, and this is something that is decided alongside the other federal states, or there is a strong sort of cooperation on that, in the second push that the pandemic has made over the past weeks and months, to make sure that we do everything we can to be able to keep educational institutions open. So schools are open, childcare is open by and large, and that I think is a major contribution as well. We have seen how important it is to make sure that women can go to work. And it is still often the case that when the children cannot go to school or have to do homeschooling, then it's often the women that on top of their jobs do even more of the support of the children and the housework at home. So I think this is an issue that one has to be wary of here as well.
Thank you.
That's a great question, Secretary Möller. I want to say the statement. Crystal knows my wife. I don't dispense a lot of advice, but when I speak to young people, I encourage them, if you choose to get married, to marry for love. However, be sure to marry someone you like. Because if you're inside the house with them for 8 months straight, it better be someone you really like. And I thank God I married a woman that I like and who likes me. So.
Right.
She's outstanding. We have some really great questions. So I'm trying to call through them, but one question is, do you think that economic development of cities will be shifting from attracting companies to attracting workers? And if that's the case, would you think that that would be to the detriment of a city like Columbia or Hamburg, or do you see that as an opportunity?
I don't have figures to underpin that, but what we have seen is that people are flocking to the cities, and cities are growing. But I wouldn't know enough about the sort of nexus that is made in the question. I wouldn't be confident to sort of answer it in a sort of way without the evidence of that. But I think it's an important thing to watch in general how, and this is something we follow closely, the transition of our economies that is happening at a large scale, where we're trying to sort of develop 21st century economies that are really challenging some of the ways we've been doing things over the past century. I think this also brings a whole number of new questions that I understand is also tackled in the project that these three institutions are engaging in, Crystal, and that you're a part of. I mean, how Does the changing sort of environment for, you know, the future of our economies, what does that mean for the questions we have to ask locally? And I think that's a very relevant one.
I'm also excited about this partnership. The discussions around the future of cities and economic development, we watch this massive rush to cities in urban areas. I am curious to see, and a bit concerned to see what the effect the pandemic will have on these generational trends. You know, our focus, I'm sitting in downtown Columbia now looking at several tall buildings. Our state capitol is just one block away. And our focus has been on density, you know, creating dense urban cores surrounded by vibrant suburbs in which people may live. And we have the benefit of being, you know, 30 minutes, you can be in the rural fishing and hunting, whatever it happens to be. And we've seen some trends of more people, not necessarily eschewing the urban core, but wanting more space. They because of the pandemic, the real estate market is vibrant here. People are buying and looking for more space. So I'm curious to see if, in fact, particularly post-vaccine, what that does. But even prior to the pandemic, back to the core of the question, I think a number of local leaders were already looking at the traditional economic development construct that many of us have relied on, how we attract businesses to our city, because we saw a good bit of data that suggested that people in every age group, I might add, were more so looking for communities that that they felt valued them, valued their priorities, that reflected that reflected them, and weren't necessarily being drawn to places because of a job, as my father was when he left rural South Carolina, he and my mother, in 1967 to migrate to New York City, where I was born and raised. Now, folks have been very aggressively trying to attract that talent, because if you attract the talent, and particularly the talent that you can build a sustainable talent pool, then usually companies will seek you out as opposed to us working aggressively to attract companies. I would also say this, as we speak about inclusion and think about inclusion in very different ways, that we talk about rural communities and everything else, I think it's so important that innovative and smart cities focus intentionally on attracting what I like to call perennials. We talk a lot about millennials and Gen Zers, but perennials, attracting folks who are 50 and over. And I don't just say that because I have gray hair now, but prior to the pandemic, research showed that 50-year-olds and 60-year-olds were starting more businesses than any other cohort. And if you were able to carve out the over 50 marketplace in the U.S. alone, it was a $7.6 trillion market. If you decide to look at that in terms of GDP, it would be the third largest economy in the world. So in the world, and obviously we're all graying, we see the silver tsunami coming at us. So in a world in which demography is destiny, it would be, I think, smart and thoughtful to also work to build cities that attract these amazingly, not just innovative and creative, but also experienced individuals that can help underpin the quality of life in our cities. How we have to build innovative, age-friendly communities.
Well, I personally love that answer as a person who started a new business during this pandemic, and I will start looking at Columbia right away to relocate. Here's a question that's really kind of close to the work I've done for most of my career. And so I think I know where Mayor Benjamin's answer might lie on this. But I definitely would love to, Secretary Möller, to hear your response. This is for both of you. Do you think cities, especially smaller ones, are facing a budget and financial crisis? And if you do, how do you think cities can overcome these issues? I think we've touched on a little bit, Secretary Möller, in terms of the structure of Hamburg and how it relates with the federal system. But I'm curious about what your thoughts are and what your experience has been there as well.
Let me, Crystal, I think it's a very important one. Let me respond to that from a wider German perspective, where we have had that discussion as well quite intensely over the past months. And I think it's the right one to say, how can even the federal level support cities that are not able to really cope with the burden of debt? And how can we make sure that there is still a very solid access to everything we believe, life should be about, even in smaller cities, because they are the backbone of, how the way our country works. And this shows you that the issue has been understood here as well and started to be addressed. We are, as a federal state, or a group of federal states, in the position that there is usually a sort of a leveling out of differences through a very complicated system that has seen various steps of reform, so in the Hamburgian perspective, and being also economically quite powerful, we are on the fortunate end of things, but from the wider German perspective, I think, and this is something that I think is really worth supporting, to look at that question and challenge, because this brings us really to the very important support that ultimately our, politics gets and government gets. If the most important sort of needs can no longer be provided for where citizens live, then I think this will create instability increasingly and unrest. And so this would be my very short answer, but I'm sure Mayor Benjamin and you, Crystal, yourself, with your background, have a lot more to say about that.
No, with consumerism, a significant consumer-based economy has created some particular challenges for American cities, for sure. Back during the early days of the pandemic, of course, we're going through our budget process. Our fiscal year ends in June, and 8 of the last 10 years, we had a budget surplus in Colombia. We've never raised taxes. We've aggressively never raised taxes since I've been there. We've aggressively invested in infrastructure, water, sewer, stormwater, and green infrastructure. We had the very first certified green bond in the country for standalone stormwater investments. It was something that was important to us. And to say it came to a screeching halt would be an understatement. We went from 8 of the last 10 years of the budget surplus to cutting our budget fairly deeply, our general fund budget by over 30%. And because we engaged in conservative budgeting practices for the last several years, we were able to do it successfully. But across the country, we're seeing what looks like maybe a $1 trillion shortfall for state and local governments all across the country. It's a difficult time, and obviously every city in this country, our fiscal DNA is dramatically different. I mean, several of the Ohio cities have they rely heavily on almost a local payroll tax. So as the economy slowed down, we watched their budgets drop precipitously. But every city is different, but every city is sharing in the very same pain right now. I believe that as we emerge from the pandemic, not just the cities, but our citizens all across this country are going to be relying heavily on the state for a very thoughtful plan to help us reemerge from the economic challenges that we're facing, which again are borne by all of us, but certainly disproportionately by folks who live in the bottom two quintiles of American society. So there's some work to be done there, but absolutely local governments are challenged right now to help meet some very basic needs. So hopefully we'll find a partner in Washington, D.C. that helps us get things moving again.
Great, thank you. One other question. What pathways do you see for better local to national integration of diplomatic activities? how can national government best channel and support the international activities of cities? Secretary Möller.
I think, Crystal, that's, if you allow, that's a great question. I've been thinking about, because we do talk a lot about the relevance of cities, and we are actually doing a lot of things, but then ultimately it comes to the question of how do we make a difference? How do we best make a difference? And where do we need other levels and layers of government to, you know, support, challenge? Where is the link? And for me, it's interesting to see that at the national level in my country, Germany, there is an interest in cities playing a role. There is a receptiveness. There is also institutional setups that allow for exchange. There is added value that is seen in our activities. But on the other hand, there are, of course, areas where the cities also, you know, engage in their own right and want to do things together with other partner cities where it's not necessarily relevant to a national level. So in some areas we will encounter like the important question of climate change, and we did talk about the Chicago Climate Charter by then, you know, launched by then Mayor Emanuel. You know, if you really want to make a difference and change, bring about change to the positive, you have to influence decision-making over international treaties, and it was addressed in the introduction that cities generally don't have that right, but they sort of, you know, how do we get to the influencing piece? And I think one first step is, and that is happening here, is that people actually really talk. The different layers talk to each other, that we have a national government, you know, with a cell of people that are interested in what the cities are doing. They're starting to talk to us, and they realize, wow, there's a lot that is happening here that we probably weren't that aware of. And on the other hand, the link of people that are based in cities and have not necessarily been exposed to international relations have been doing quite a few very important contributions to international relations and their city partnerships, etc., and didn't really know necessarily that it was a contribution also to international relations, and sort of start that conversation, institutionalize it a bit more, but also address, you know, where really things don't need necessarily to change very much, because as cities we can reach out in a day and age where technology allows us to sort of do that, and allows our citizens to do that as well, because it's not only, I saw it in the chat function, somebody asked the question, who is actually engaging? And we welcome a lot of engagement that is not actually driven by, you know, politicians or a state level, but that is driven by civil society, by our citizens, by school partnerships, by, you know, a lot of activities that once you've sort of made a link can flourish, can sort of develop. And I think that is the beauty of also of city relations, because we are not always talking international affairs, obviously. We are linking up on very, very concrete questions. And so for me, yes, there is a route that we should learn more about these different levels, but also, you know, there is a lot of things that are happening, and quite rightly so, in their own right.
No, I couldn't agree more with the Secretary. It all starts with dialogue, and dialogue that particularly can be focused on maybe even a very specific data point. If it's a city that has some type of a special connection, economic investment from a company from X country, using that as a focus point, or some intellectuals or professors at your universities or colleges. I mentioned earlier that I was in the process of establishing a relationship with Accra and Taichung early in my tenure as mayor. That was because a local educator who distinguished himself well had gone back home and became the mayor of Accra, and that a PhD student who studied as a graduate student here at the University of South Carolina had gone back home and he became the mayor of Taichung. So having someone in place who had some familiarity, maybe even some affection for the city, was so much more important to me than starting a greenfield relationship that had no connectivity. So every community has that with some other community abroad. So I think there's an opportunity to start something there, and maybe finding some structured way to require all of our public officials to dig a little deeper and see where the synchronicity does indeed exist. I've had the good fortune of dialoguing with so many of our friends from across the Atlantic, primarily facilitated by my role in the organizations I mentioned earlier, but also by our World Affairs Council. We've had a visit, a delegation from Italy, Germany, and France, wanting my opinions as they were traveling the country on the elections as they were upcoming, and I was on my very best behavior, but sharing with them my impressions of what I thought would happen and how I hoped it would happen. And then earlier last year, in 2019, I received Ambassador Haber from Germany when the president was making some significant decisions as related to trade with Germany. She thought it wise to visit with local government officials all across the state who might be able to leverage relationships not only with the White House, but with Senators Graham and Scott, with Ambassador Haley, who was still at the UN at the time. And it allowed us to be fully involved and engaged in the dialogue, and hopefully to work to improve the policy making on the national level. But it starts and it ends with constant and continuous dialogue, especially once you find that synchronicity where our local interests overlap with some of the local interests on the other side of the Atlantic. They exist in every single community. I think it just requires, again, some intentionality to exploit them in a positive manner.
Thank you so much. I want to thank both of you for your time, talent, and energy today. We are done with our question session here, but whatever questions are remaining, we'll take it back to the project group and they will sort of dissect it a little bit. We're now moving into the session of closing remarks. I would like to call on my colleague partner, Anna Herhausen, who will give us our closing remarks. Thank you both, Mayor Benjamin and Secretary Möller.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Crystal. Thank you very much, Mayor Benjamin. Thank you very much, Almut Möller, for this engaging and really, I would say, also uplifting session this afternoon here in Germany, morning in the US. Thank you very much for your really candid remarks of the challenges and the opportunities you see. I think I would like to also thank very much our fellows of the New Urban Progress program, who at some point in this year, when the pandemic was already in full swing, so to say, nevertheless decided to apply for a Transatlantic Fellows program. That is a really, really good sign, and we hope that with all the plans B and C we had to come up with and implement this year, you still feel engaged and ready to continue the work. At Alfred Herhausen Gesellschaft, we as one of the partners for this program, we've been actually interested in the phenomenon of urbanization for more than 15 years. We started our own program together with the London School of Economics called Urban Age, a series of conferences and accompanying research that actually visited sort of the mega cities internationally that we know of. And looking back on this project, we realized that we've somehow managed to build a global family almost of urbanists. Now, when I think of New Urban Progress, I think it's great that this time around we've managed to think of this network and of the relationship and the dialogue that will happen from the very beginning. It's not a byproduct, sort of a fortunate one accidentally, but actually a key element of this. So I think this is really great for you to be continuing sharing experiences, sharing both best practices, but also maybe some of the things that didn't work so well that also helps in taking things forward. And not to forget also in co-creating. So the fellows will be working on some of the specific issues we outlined, for example, social cohesion in more detail. It's been said several times today, and we talk quite a lot about the pandemic, so that cities really are microcosms of all the challenges we're facing today. And sometimes when you look at it in sort of the big picture, these challenges can seem quite intractable, and yet in the cities, solutions are again and again being found and implemented. So I think this is a really great case for hope, and I'm happy that we can continue to bring this sort of into the limelight a little bit more. In addition, I'm also really happy that this Transatlantic Fellows Program now has some tailwind, I would say, for the Transatlantic Partnership or the Transatlantic relationship, and that the fellows and everybody who is engaged with them can utilize that and doesn't have to build this sort of city level exchange despite what's going on the international level, but hopefully in tandem. We've talked about a number of topics, and of course the pandemic and dealing with that is front and center on everybody's minds. I think there is, in addition, a great momentum to really use this crisis to also make progress on a number of different issues. And I think, therefore, the fellows have their work cut out for them after this first year of preparing and getting to know each other. I wish them all the best in the coming time, where actually they will be working at specific issues together. And I would like to thank them also on behalf of course, das Progressive Zentrum and Progressive Policy Institute for their engagement. Last but not least, I think I also speak on behalf of PPI when I would like to say thank you very much, especially Maria and Diego, for your fantastic management of the new urban progress program. For being so flexible, for coming up with plans B and C, and for keeping everyone engaged. This is, despite all the challenges and things we've had to do in the last months, something that is really a sign of, I would say, a sign of hope and really encouraging. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anna. Thank you so much to our great partners, great speakers, to the great team, and great audiences for all your questions. Please follow the project on near-urban-progress.org, and we look forward to meeting you at the next events. Thank you.